Herzlich willkommen. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our long-awaited conference on Ethnicizing Europe. My name is Éva Kovács, and this is my honor and pleasure to introduce our first speakers who will give some welcome notes to the conference. First of all, Alma Zadić, Bundesministerin für Justiz der Republik Österreich, will give a short talk, and then Terezija Stoisits, Vorstandsvorsitzende des VWI, wird auch ein paar Worte an ihn sagen. Also now the floor is Alma Zadić.
Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome from the Austrian Federal Ministry of Justice. I'm very pleased that you are joining us today from all over the world. In 2013, the Simon Wiesenthal conference took place here at the Palais Trautson. We would have been very happy to open our doors to you again this year. But the pandemic unfortunately interfered with our plans, as it did for so many events this and also last year. But that will not stop us. It is therefore my big pleasure to welcome you online. First, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers and contributors of today's conference. Your work is an important contribution to the understanding of the past. But not alone that. Your research also helps us all to better shape the future. Thank you very much for your outstanding work. At this year's conference, you are discussing the period after the Versailles Peace Treaty. Your essays deal with the hatred, the nationalization, the ethnicization that happened to Europe after the World War I. Much of that hatred of that time later condensed into violence. And we all know what was at the end of this development, the ultimate breach of civilization, which today we call the Shoah, the Holocaust, the Mauthausen stairs of death, the gas chambers of Auschwitz, the industrially engineered killing, and the biggest crime of human history. I ask you, what responsibility arises from all of this for us who are born later? We must do everything in our power to ensure that the Shoah will never be repeated, which means we have to recognize early stages as soon as possible. Fight against anti-Semitism, dehumanization, discrimination, racism at a very early stage, because we all know where it can get us. Thus, analyzing the situation after World War I is an incredibly relevant period, because nowadays we can learn a lot from this period and do all we can to prevent these things from happening. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you an inspiring, successful conference in which you will learn a lot from each other. A conference in which you can exchange ideas and find new friends and new exchanges. In short, a conference that will be remembered in a positive way. Perhaps we will manage to welcome you next year here in the Austrian Federal Ministry of Justice at the Palais Trautson. I would be very pleased. Thank you and enjoy the event.
Good afternoon to everybody watching us and contributing to this very interesting conference. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to welcome you. Mein Name ist Terezija Stoisits. Ich bin die Vorstandsvorsitzende des Simon Wiesenthal Instituts für Holocaust-Studien und freue mich sehr, dass ich Sie heute alle begrüßen kann. Dobrodošli danas, iako samo virtualno, na današnjoj i sutrašnjoj konferenciji. Ich möchte Sie mit einem ganz kleinen, aber dafür persönlichen und für mich biografisch relevanten sozusagen Gedanken zu dieser Konferenz begrüßen und einleiten. Ich bin eine Burgenländerin, eine burgenländische Kroatin, und in diesem Jahr, 1921 wollte ich sagen, 2021 feiert das Burgenland, es ist die östlichste Provinz Österreichs, das östlichste Bundesland, 100 Jahre Burgenland, 100 Jahre als ein Teil Österreichs. Das ist ein schöner Anlass, um schöne Feiern, Ausstellungen, Konzerte, Interventionen zu machen. Es ist aber auch ein Anlass, um darüber nachzudenken, was manchen, die in dieser Region leben, vor 100 Jahren widerfahren ist oder auch passiert ist und wie die Ereignisse vor inzwischen mehr als 100 Jahren nach Ende des Ersten Weltkrieges, aber speziell im Jahr 1921, als es sehr gravierende Auswirkungen durch die Friedensverträge für die Bewohner dieses Landstrichs, den es ja damals in dieser Form noch gar nicht gab und der entstanden ist, das Burgenland gab. Und hier, das ist der persönliche Bezug, die Minderheit der burgenländischen Kroaten, die wurde durch diesen Versuch, eine neue Ordnung in diese nationalstaatlichen Realitäten, wie sie entstanden sind und die tatsächlich ja auch geschaffen wurden und das, was gesetzt wurde, die waren davon sehr betroffen. Denn seit 100 Jahren leben die burgenländischen Kroaten auf 4 verschiedene Nationen und 4 verschiedene Länder verteilt. Es ist eine Grenze entstanden, die vorher keine Grenze war. Und diesseits und jenseits der Grenze leben burgenländische Kroaten, Gradišćanski Hrvati. Und darum meine ich, dass das ein gutes Beispiel dafür ist, wie damals die Menschen und bis hin heute in ihrer Entwicklung betroffen sind von den Friedensverträgen und von dem Ergebnis, dass ein Krieg für sie letztendlich in Friedenszeiten jetzt nach 100 Jahren Burgenland auch noch bedeutet. Minderheiten, die wurden zu Mehrheiten, Mehrheiten wurden zu Minderheiten, Minderheiten blieben Minderheiten, wurden aber auseinandergerissen. Und das ist ein Faktum, dem in einem auch so Jubiläumsjahr, wie das im Burgenland jetzt stattfindet, auch Augenmerk geschenkt werden muss und sollte. Und in der Konferenz selbst wird dieses Thema sicher auch behandelt werden, wiewohl es nicht als ein expliziter Teil aufscheint, aber da die Burgenländer Kroaten überall sind, wo Betroffenheit herrscht, wird das sicher wesentlich sein. Und so ist die Brücke zur Konferenz auch zu Simon Wiesenthal geschlagen, denn Simon Wiesenthal ist seit seines Lebens einer gewesen, der sehr auf Minderheiten und sehr auf ausgegrenzte Gruppen geachtet hat und dem die Opfer des Zweiten Weltkrieges insgesamt und insbesondere natürlich die Opfer der Shoah ein großes Anliegen waren. Ich wünsche allen, die einen Beitrag leisten, gutes Gelingen, bedanke mich ganz herzlich und jetzt kann der inhaltliche Teil tatsächlich starten. Vielen herzlichen Dank.
Liebe Terezija, vielen, vielen Dank für die schöne Einführung. Jetzt werden wir ein bisschen über den Inhalt der Tagung reden und ich werde auf Englisch weiter reden. I would like to introduce our friends and colleagues who were active in the conceptualization of this conference, and I want to stress my special thanks in this beautiful cooperation. Raul Cârstocea, he's a honorary research fellow in modern European history at the University of Leicester. His research interests focus on anti-Semitism, nationalism, fascism, and more broadly on state formation and nation-building processes in the 19th and 20th century, Central and Eastern Europe, and their consequences for minority groups. And I'm really happy to add one more information. He has co-edited our earlier conference volume entitled Modern Anti-Semitism in the Peripheries, Europe and its Colonies, 1945, and it was really a beautiful cooperation with Raul. So Raul, the floor is yours. Please say some words about the concept.
Thank you very much, Éva, and thank you for this kind introduction, and I would also like to welcome you on behalf of us, the organizers, to the conference. Hope you enjoy the next few days, and I'm going to be speaking a bit about what we meant when we called the conference Ethnicizing Europe, i.e., while the conference will deal with hate and violence in the post-Versailles period, I would like to say a few things about the Paris Peace Conference itself and why we view it according to this lens of ethnicizing Europe. Of course, you all know the conference marked the end of the First World War, and we initially planned this conference for 2020 to coincide with the signing of the minority treaties at the Paris Peace Conference, with 100 years, since the signing of the minority treaties at the Paris Peace Conference. And the conference marked not just the end of the First World War, but also the collapse of the empires in Central and Eastern Europe, the Habsburg, the Ottoman, the Romanov, and the German empires, where the map of Europe was considerably redrawn, and nation states took the place of the collapsed empires. And what we meant by ethnicizing Europe is this process whereby the nation state became, if not the exclusive, then certainly the normative way of organizing the international system after the Versailles Peace. So while before the 19th century had witnessed the coexistence of empires with emerging nation states, the contest of imperialism and nationalism, what we have at Versailles is an inscribing of the principle of nationality, of ethnicity, as the keystone to not just the internal order of states, but also to the international order. The nation is thereby made normative, and this comes to replace an earlier hybrid, you can call it fluid if you want, but certainly much more complex viewing of identity. An identity which could be not just national, but also local, linguistic, confessional. It was often intersecting. Bilingualism and multilingualism were very common in these areas, as you all know. All of this changed after Versailles because the nation became normative and because ethnicity became the cornerstone of international order, as I mentioned earlier. And then thereby populations were sharply divided into majorities and minorities. Now, this was by no means made with bad intentions, and there's, I think, something important to keep in mind if we are to draw lessons from the past to think of our present, which also witnesses a rise in nationalism and emphasis on ethnicity, which just a couple of decades ago was certainly not so prominent on the agenda as it is today. The peacemakers who met at Versailles had every intention to protect minorities, and if the system that came out of it eventually failed to protect those minorities, and instead of protecting them, ended up exposing them to more hatred and more violence, then I think we still need to examine why and what happened that led to this failure, and what unintended consequences the system of protection of national minorities, which was put in place at Versailles, actually had. Of course, there's a lot of scholarship already dealing with this, but I think we can study it far more in view of new paradigms. And of these new paradigms, one that I personally think is very important for the present conference, and one that I'm sure that my colleagues will be touching upon as well in their brief introductions, is that of national indifference, and not necessarily just of national indifference, but this view of diversity in the area of Central and Eastern Europe as a much more complex phenomenon than one simply structured along the binary of majority and minority. And along these lines, it's important to introduce these persisting hierarchies, persisting imperial hierarchies, whereby only some states were made to acquiesce to minority protections, whereas others did not, whereby some states that were somehow pushed into recognizing minority rights were not exactly keen on following up on their commitments, were not exactly keen on applying those minority rights and implementing legislation to protect minorities. And all of this eventually created the preconditions for what we then encounter in the interwar period, and especially during the Second World War, i.e. a specific targeting of minorities as victim groups. But before that, I think the element that I just want to emphasize once more at the end of this short introduction is that the the factor of ethnicity was by no means the exclusive one, or was by no means even the most important one in the self-identity of the populations that the Versailles Peace Treaty came to address. It was one of many, and it was one which was not foretold to have become the most important one. If it did so, it was in large part the consequence of the Versailles Conference itself and of the context in which it emerged, one which saw also the socialist challenge. That's something that the peacemakers of Versailles certainly wanted to avoid, and you can see this reflected in the form that these minority rights took, i.e. primarily cultural and linguistic rather than socio-economic, and this avoidance of the socio-economic dimension of minority rights is still a very important one that persists to this day, whereby minority rights tend to be cultural and linguistic and less so socioeconomic, although this is slightly changing and institutions are slowly realizing that this is a problem. Unequal access to economic resources was one of the things which from the outset marked one of the failures of the minority protection regime in interwar Europe. And I don't want to keep this too long, and I want to conclude now and just pass the floor to my colleague Gábor Egry, who will add to these introductory remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Raul, and maybe the audience can imagine how we try to fine-tune our call with such a huge universe of different questions and conceptualizations. So just a couple of words about Gábor Egry. Gábor is a historian and the director of the Institute of Political History in Budapest. His main research interests are nationalism, politics of memory, everyday ethnicity, state building in modern Central and Eastern Europe. He is the principal investigator of the ERC-funded consolidator project Nepostrans, negotiating post-imperial transitions from remobilization to nation-state consolidation. So exactly the topic which we will discuss in the next few days. A comparative study of local and regional transitions in post-Habsburg East and Central Europe between 1917 and 1930. So Gábor, please.
So thank you very much, Éva, and I'm also very grateful for having been involved in the organization of the conference, and I'm really happy that finally it will take place. I also think that, well, 2021 is not that bad moment for having this anniversary conference, as Terezija Stoisits mentioned. We still have something to remember of what came out of the First World War. After Raul dealt with more abstract and much more larger scale aspects of the conference, I will try to add something on small scale issues, really hoping to somehow introduce the conference and not dwelling on anything very heavy in theory or whatever could really make dull this introductory section and make people leaving the Zoom rooms. So the last decades saw an encouraging trend in the historiography of Central and Eastern Europe, a new critical turn to ethnicity. Inspired and informed by sociology, historians started to look at what ethnicity meant for the functioning of societies and revealed ambiguity, indifference, instrumentality, just to name a few of the important findings of these works. As ethnicity or nationalism was previously posited in the historiography as the main driving force of social transformation and the ultimately successful framework of modernity, this new approach had significance beyond the narrow cases these works studied, incentivizing a broader turn in the evaluation of the Habsburg Empire and how much nationalism was the only route to democracy and modernization in the region. Nevertheless, it is hard to deny that post-1918, ethnicity was the basic principle of state and nationhood. The nation-state was postulated as the proper institutional frame of democracy and rule of law. Despite ongoing imperial and interstate integration efforts, this Wilsonian moment lasted until today, with all of its consequences, and not all of them positive. Ethnicity was lifted from the private to the public and made political. It has subsequently infused the state and gave way to racial fantasies, while it was also a container of human rights and legal equality too. Ethnicizing societies was not a contested program anymore. it was self-evident. But, and this is the lesson of the variegated papers which will be presented at the conference, many of them looking at small scales, ethnicity as a perception of human difference, as a practice, remained diverse and ambiguous. A bottom-up perspective applied to the post-1918 period yields similar conclusions as the analysis of the pre-First World War era. It reveals the same phenomena even if the politics surrounding ethnicity had changed, often for the worse. Nationalists hoped and still hope to create an ethnically homogeneous world, and they make homogeneity a defining characteristic of any nation. Historians of ethnicity, however, mostly reveal contestation, rivalry, ambiguity, competition around ethnicity. And attentive observers can easily find it today, even within the most homogeneous societies. If not the ethnicity of alleged group members claimed by rival nationalists, then the content and authenticity of national belonging within the same group is heavily contested today too. Complaints about deteriorated, ill, disappearing nationality are quite frequent, to the extent that one can easily claim that national indifference is at least as salient an issue for nationalist activists today as it was 100 or 120 years ago. Thus, it is maybe time to reverse how we understood communities like nations. Instead of homogeneity, it is inherent heterogeneity that is their most important feature. Today, at the beginning of our conference, such propositions are provocative hypotheses. But I hope that in 3 days' time, after listening to the papers, we will see some justification, this kind of revision too. Maybe making peace with the inherent heterogeneity of any human society is the ultimate peace to conclude at the end of the First World War.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. I will just continue this line. When we started to planning this conference 2 years ago, one of the main issues we identified was the peace treaties can be seen as attempts to establish an order corresponding to the new realities of nationhood. Irrespective of the fact whether or not the peace led to new conflicts, the new regimes of ethnicity combined with the legal creation of minorities and majorities, nations and nationalities, inclusion and exclusion. Forging a clear ethnic and national identity allowed no shades of grey. Previously diffuse identities, sentiments and loyalties had to become unambiguous after 1920. International regulations and institutions were designed to discipline and control the process. Let me illustrate this phenomenon from a particular perspective of the Central European Jewry. Let's travel back in time and arrive in Aperiash Prešov in the new Czechoslovak Republic in 1921, just because we haven't mentioned this region yet. And this is also 1921. In this year, a Hungarian Jewish intellectual, Aladar Komlós, publishes a pamphlet with the title Jewish on the Crossroads. I quote, "The truth is that I am a Hungarian, a Jew and an internationalist at the same time. And take a look on these assimilated Jews. One is more nationalist than the other, but all of them are radical, tend to be socialist. Although we have no reason for not being loyal to our new states, changing our Hungarian character overnight would be a renegade behavior. If our Hungarianness is a skin only, one does not give up the skin very easily, and it is impossible to cast it quickly both for moral and technical reasons. If someone adopts or double skin, we may prove it experimentally, be the Hungarian and it will etch, be the Jew and it will etch even more. We can etch twice," quote end. The quote could be taken as a sign of chronic Jewish ambivalence or an illustration of society's refusal of the Jewish assimilation creativity. Furthermore, it could be also understood as an example of exaggerated assimilation. However, in this pamphlet, besides revealing the ambiguities of the assimilationist nationalist social contract, Komlós also reflects on the cosmopolitism, radicalism, and leftism of the Jewish people. What did Komlós and those of his Jewish contemporaries who lived in the new states after the dissolution of the monarchy expect from the future? As the quotation shows, at that time they counted on the continuation of the pre-war nationalist assimilation discourse. On the one hand, they assumed that they would have to choose between the former Hungarian and the new Slovak assimilation pressure. On the other, Komlós also stressed a general existential fear that the vernacular culture of the Hungarian Jews living in the new nation states might disappear. What was your point, Daisy? The fear of cultural extinction was not a particular Jewish sentiment. On the contrary, it became a fundamental frame of reference for the national majorities as well. Komlós was not a pragmatic individual in terms of his cultural and political choices, but rather an emblematic protagonist of the ethnicized Central European post-Versailles landscape. What was the long-term impact of the Paris Peace Treaties on defining peoples as members of an ethnic, cultural, or national group, and in shaping their responses? The idea of nation-states became a nightmare for many minorities, religious, national, or ethnic groups. All of a sudden, they were obliged to identify themselves ethnically or religiously, often facing state-controlled xenophobia or anti-Semitism or open violence. In addition to these issues that Gábor and Raul have already touched upon, these topics will also come up, I hope, in the next 3 days of the conference. So welcome again. Thank you very much for the introductory notes. And unfortunately, there is an online conference, which means that we can turn simultaneously to the first panel.